Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Astrid Johansson, the IHF Director of Operations, and I'm joined by the rest of the curatorial team to present you with an overview of the Epic Iran exhibition. We will have, in order of appearance, John Curtis, the Academic Director of IHF and formerly the Keeper of the Middle East Department at the British Museum, Alex Magoob, the Exhibition Research Assistant at the V&A, Tim Stanley, Senior Curator at the V&A and Co-Curator of the Jamil Prize, Sara Piram, the IHF Curator for the Iranian Collections, and finally, Ina Sarikhani Samman, Director and Co-Founder of the Sarikhani Collection. We hope you will have seen that the exhibition will now be opening on the 29th of May, and details of how to book tickets and buy the catalogue can be found on our website as well as on the V&A's. Before we start, I'd just like to remind you all that this session is being recorded, so if you know someone who wasn't able to register, we will be sharing a link in due course. If you have any questions, please do submit these using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. You can send in your questions at any point, and we will come to them at the end of the presentation. We have a lot of information to cover in rather a short amount of time, so I will just give a very brief introduction to the exhibition before handing over to the rest of the team. The work on this exhibition has been going on for over 2 years now. But even before that, the IHF had been wanting to find a way of putting together a show about Iran's rich history. Similarly, the Sarikhani Collection wanted to showcase its pieces to the wider public. And of course, the V&A is one of the largest and finest collections of Islamic art from Iran. And this show was a great opportunity for the museum to be able to highlight a number of their objects in a different way. So this collaboration means that we have a collective knowledge as well as many of the objects needed to tell this story. The exhibition covers an enormous amount of material and a huge timescale, spanning over 5,000 years. This is an unusual approach when it comes to exhibiting Iranian material, as the ancient, medieval Islamic, and contemporary pieces would normally each be treated separately. By bringing all of these periods and objects together, we hope to demonstrate the long continuity of Iranian culture and identity, reflected in its art and design, as well as its literature and language, and bring its great history to more people's attention. This will be the first major display of Iranian art and material in the UK since the 1931 exhibition of Persian art at the Royal Academy, which featured an overwhelming 2,000 plus pieces. Not only has it been 90 years since there was last an extensive presentation of Iranian objects, but there have also been a number of important changes since then, which means this will be the first show of its kind in the UK. Firstly, many of the important archaeological discoveries that tell us more about the earliest periods in Iran were only made from the 1960s onwards. This means that a lot of the material was unknown to people in 1931. And in many ways, if these discoveries had been made in the 20s and 30s, like many key discoveries in Egypt and Mesopotamia, it would have been clear back then that the ancient civilizations of the Iranian plateau were just as rich and developed, and perhaps people would be more widely familiar with it today. Secondly, the study of Islamic period Iran was very much in its early stages in the 1930s, and at that time, pieces were often valued on their artistic appearance alone, while there was not a great understanding of the accompanying texts. Since then, the study and appreciation of these objects and texts together and their academic treatment has evolved. Finally, in terms of modern art, this didn't yet exist at the time and only really emerged from the 1940s. And of course, this is the first opportunity for contemporary pieces to be considered in the same context as the ancient and medieval objects. In order to present this huge amount of history, we have broken the exhibition down into 10 sections. The first introductory section is an immersive audiovisual experience, which aims to demonstrate the great variety of landscapes across Iran, from mountains and forests to deserts and coastlines, all of which have played some part in shaping Iran's history over time. This introduction also gives the visitor an idea of the physical landscape and geography from which the exhibition comes. I'll now pass over to John, who will take us through the next 2 sections. And don't forget to send us your questions as we go along.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Astrid, for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you all today on the subject of the Epic Iran exhibition, And it gives me a chance to say that I'd wanted to curate an exhibition about Iran from early times to the present day, even before I joined IHF in 2014. So it's been a great opportunity to be able to do this in collaboration with the V&A and the Sarikhani Foundation. As it is, the IHF, that's Astrid and myself, has been responsible for curating the first three sections of this exhibition. Well, where we start is the second section after the introduction, Emerging Iran. And this deals with the art and history of Iran before the period of the Persian Empire, starting in about 3200 BC with the first writing in Iran, because history is often reckoned to begin with the introduction of writing. And from this early period, that is about 3200 to 2900 BC, we've got clay tablets written in a script known as Proto-Elamite. Such tablets have been found at places like Susa and Tapisial. The writing is largely pictographic and it's difficult to understand, but these early tablets are mainly lists of commodities, such as sheep. People often ask where writing was first invented, but the truth is that it appeared at more or less the same time in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Iran for exactly the same reason, and that is because with developing economies, it becomes essential to be able to record complex or even simple transactions. There may be a few hundred years between the introduction of writing in the different areas, but they were all independent inventions, or rather innovations, and for exactly the same reason. Next slide, please. Now, the next image shows some of the objects dating from the middle of the third millennium BC. That's around about 2500 BC. As Astrid has already told you, in the period between the First and Second World Wars, when the term the Fertile Crescent was invented and people were talking about the birth of civilization, Iran was very much left out of that because many of the great discoveries were made at sites in eastern Iran, more or less since the 1960s. Nowadays, one would think of Iran as having a civilization that's just as rich and prosperous as nearby Mesopotamia. The only difference really is that in Mesopotamia, there are thousands of clay tablets, documents. Writing was not so common in Iran, but these early Iranian centers enjoyed long distance trade contacts to the west with Mesopotamia and the Levant, and to the east, even as far as the Indus Valley. The next one. Now, it's thought that most of the early inhabitants of Iran spoke Elamite, and Elamite civilization was spread over much of the plateau in the third millennium, gradually withdrew to the southwestern part of Iran, which we now call Khuzestan. And in the period between about 1500 and 1100, Elam enjoyed a very rich and prosperous, had a very rich and prosperous civilization with an accompanying magnificent material culture. Many of the objects from the Elamite center of Susa are now in the Louvre, and amongst them are a number of very large-scale bronze castings. But in the exhibition, there's a very magnificent miniature bronze casting, which you can see in the center of the screen here, and it shows two worshippers standing on a plinth. It's a wonderful triumph of the bronzesmith's art. It's actually from the Sarikhani Collection. It was presumably put into a shrine to represent these two people, these perhaps a king and a queen, in perpetuity. The next one, please. Then from round about 1500 BC, tribes invaded Iran speaking Iranian languages, and amongst them are the peoples that we come to know of later as the Medes and the Persians. And these Iranian-speaking peoples established a number of petty states and kingdoms on the west side of the plateau, in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, and amongst them is a place called Malik, which is just to the south of the Caspian Sea. And around about Malik, a number of cemeteries have been discovered containing magnificent gold vessels, of which you can see 3 here on the screen, 2 of them from the Sarikhani Collection and 1 from the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And some of the graves in this Malik civilization contained pottery vessels in the shape of humpbacked bulls or zebus. You can see one at the top left. Exactly why is unclear, but they might have been drinking vessels, perhaps, which were used in funeral ceremonies, and then were placed in the graves. The next one. Another of these kingdoms in the, we're now talking about early 1st millennium BC, 900 to 700, that sort of a date, is called Alippi. It covered the modern province of Luristan, and the Luristan civilization is best known for many hundreds of bronzes, which were found in graves thought to belong to nomadic horsemen. And amongst these bronzes, horse trappings are particularly numerous, and there are some very nice examples in the exhibition. Another of the Iron Age sites represented is Tapi Sialk on the edge of the Great Salt Desert. There's a big spouted vessel bottom left, and Tapi Sialk is actually probably the most important archaeological site before the Persian Empire period, not just in Iran, but perhaps in the whole of the Middle East. And I might just add here that Iran Heritage Foundation has recently organized 3 different conferences about Tapi Sialk, 2 in London and 1 in Paris. And there's a publication. If anybody's interested in that, they should contact the IHF office. So next one, please. Well, then in 550 BC, Cyrus the Great, the king of Anshan, seized power, deposed his grandfather, Median grandfather Astyages, and founded the Persian Empire. The first capital was Pasargadae, but rather better known, and building work started soon after that as at Persepolis. And in the exhibition, we have a number of stone carvings from Persepolis. And what we've been able to do is to demonstrate how these stone carvings were originally colored. They're all nowadays, of course, rather bland and plain, but in common with many ancient sculptures, they were painted in magnificent colors originally. And what we've been able to do is to project colors onto some casts which have been borrowed from the British Museum. And you can see an example of that on the top right. It actually looks very dramatic indeed. And underneath that is a series of casts of polychrome glazed bricks from Susa, which are in the V&A collection, but haven't been exhibited. If they were ever exhibited, they haven't been on exhibition for about 100 years. And these, the figures represented here, are Persian guardsmen, probably belonging to the elite corps known as the Immortals, who guarded the king. The next one, please. Well, we don't just have reliefs from Persepolis in this section of the exhibition, but also some of the magnificent small objects from this period. There's 2 things here from the Oxus treasure, a bracelet and the gold chariot. Examples below that of polychrome jewelry with polychrome inlay, and 2 drinking vessels over on the right, and There's another one not illustrated here, a wonderful gold right on drinking vessel from the Metropolitan Museum. And one might just say that after the Battle of Plataea, when the Greek troops entered the Persian camp, they were amazed at the number of gold and silver vessels that they discovered there. Next one. But probably the highlight of the ancient Persian section is the Cyrus Cylinder. This is, of course, one of the icon. It's become an icon, in fact, for Iranians and for others. It was actually it was inscribed on the orders of Cyrus after he captured Babylon in 539 BC. And it reinforces the impression given both in the Bible and by the classical authors that Cyrus was an enlightened and just ruler. At this time, of course, the Persian Empire covered a vast area stretching from the Aral Sea to North Africa. So Cyrus had to work out a way of governing such a huge territory, and he did so by compromise and conciliation rather than oppression and confrontation. Well, at that point, I'll hand over now to my colleague Alexander Nagub, who's going to take us through the Parthian and Sassanian sections. Alex.
Thank you, John. Hello to everyone. So the next chapter in the exhibition is called Last of the Ancient Empires. These are the Parthian and Sassanian empires, of course, which ruled in Iran for a significant period of time, about 800 years or so. So between where the last section finishes and this one begins, there is a small gap in our chronology. This accounts for the conquest of the Persian Empire in 330 BC by Alexander of Macedon, or Alexander the Great, as he's better known, and the subsequent division of Alexander's empire into smaller states under his successors, specifically in Iran. It was the Seleucid dynasty that came to power. But in the grand scheme of Iran's long history, this Hellenistic interlude lasts for a very short period, relatively speaking. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, a new Iranian dynasty was already on the rise when a nomadic tribe invaded the region of Parthia in the northeast of Iran. The invaders established themselves here, and they subsequently became known as the Parthians. The Parthians then expanded their kingdom into an empire, and already by 141 BC, they had driven the Seleucids out of Iran and captured their capital, Seleucia, on the Tigris in Mesopotamia, not too far from where Baghdad is now. So as Parthian power and its sphere of influence grew, Iranian elements became much more apparent in the art of the ruling class. The two coins you can see on the screen now from the British Museum's collection, these are quite good examples of this. So the earlier coin above was struck under the Parthian King of Kings, Orodes II, in 37 BC. The king shown here in profile, he wears a V-neck jacket, which is part of the Iranian riding costume, and very similar to the type of costume worn by many of the Iranian peoples depicted in the reliefs at Persepolis in the earlier Achaemenid period. On this coin, you can just about see some of the rich decoration that was sewn into the king's costume, like the star just at the top of his sleeve. And there's also a winged leaping mythological creature a little further down on his chest. The king also wears a torque necklace with many spirals, and again terminating in a wonderful leaping creature. Then tied around Orodes' head, you can see the outline of his multiple diadem bands. The diadem had been a symbol of kingship and royalty in the ancient Near East for centuries already before the Parthians. But it's under the Parthians when we begin to see these sort of stacked diadem bands that really accentuates his royal authority. The later coin below was struck about 64 years later under Artabanus II. Here we see a very specific Parthian trait, which is to depict portraits from the front rather than from the side. This new aspect, you can see here, he highlights the bushy Parthian hairstyle of the king. You can see the V shape of his V-neck jacket very clearly, and also the many diadem bands tied around his head, and just about as well see the two ties coming off the sides of his head. In the center of the screen from the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art is a sandstone relief of a male figure standing in a worshipping pose. His belted trouser suit is very intricately decorated with geometric patterns. And of course, he's also standing in this frontal pose that's characteristic of the art of this time. To the right, we have another relief, this time of a mostly nude deity, except for his cloak. And he's also holding a club in one hand, you can see. This figure has been identified as Heracles in the Hellenistic tradition, or as the divine warrior being Varathragna in the Iranian tradition. And interestingly, he also wears a diadem band around his head. And we know from the Gathas, or the Avestan hymns of the Zoroastrian tradition, that Varathragna is one of the protectors of the Havarna. And that is the kingly glory that was bestowed on kings by the divine world. So this relief is thought to have been found at the site of Masjid Suleiman in southwestern Iran, and there was a temple dedicated to this deity there. So on to the next slide. Thank you. The Parthians were overthrown in the year 224 by a new dynasty from the southern part of Iran. This is, of course, the Sassanians. Several important developments happened during this period. Firstly, Zoroastrianism was established as a state religion. Secondly, there's also the consolidation of various artistic and architectural traditions. And these would continue to be drawn upon even after the Sassanians were overthrown in the Islamic conquest. Silver dishes engraved with royal and feasting scenes are some of the most iconic pieces from this period. The dish from the British Museum on the screen, this depicts a Sassanian king showing off his hunting skills, and he's attacking a pair of stags. You'll notice he's dressed in a very ornate trouser costume with a crown on his head as well. The ribbons fluttering behind his head, these are the ties of his diadem band, which encircles the base of his crown. I mentioned earlier that the diadem had been a symbol of kingship for centuries, but now under the Sassanians, it evolves again. And we see this exaggeration of the ribbons that suggests the ruler's kingly splendor. The crown worn here resembles that was worn by Shapur I, who ruled from 240 to 272. But other aspects of the costume suggests the dish was probably made at a later date. So the maker of this dish was most likely reflecting back to the time of Shapur I and the glories of his reign. The bronze bust to the right from the Sarikhani Collection, this appears to portray Yazdigird II. He ruled a bit later in 439 to 457. We can see here details of the jewelry worn by this king, including his earrings, which they may have been large luminous pearls or something like that. There's also a large crescent moon at the center of his crown, which would have had a religious significance. Perhaps it was a symbol of one of the Zoroastrian divine beings. So in the exhibition, we also take a look at the Zoroastrian religion under the Sassanians and highlight the long history of the religion from ancient times to the present day. As I said a bit earlier, it was under the Sassanians that Zoroastrianism became a state religion. In Sassanian art, birds were a popular ornamental motif, and they seem to have held a religious meaning. So for example, the repeating pheasant motif that can be seen on the red silk textile at the top right. The pheasants each have a diadem tied around their neck with ribbons fluttering behind, as well as a royal halo around their heads. The iconography, here it highlights the special bond between kingship and religion. And some centuries later, in the 10th century, the Arab historian and traveler Masudi, he described this ideology when he wrote of the Sassanians, stating, religion and kingship are two brothers. Religion is the foundation of kingship, and kingship protects religion. This silk textile was made either in the late Sassanian or perhaps even the early Islamic period, but it was transported to Jouarre Abbey in France sometime before the 11th century, quite early. There are a few of these textiles which have ended up in similar settings, and that's because when Crusaders brought back relics to Europe, they would often wrap them in precious silks, just like this example. So the last object I'll highlight is the Zoroastrian manuscript from the British Library. This is a rare manuscript of the Bid of Dad Zadeh, and it contains these sort of lovely illustrations of trees. And this was made in Yazd in 1647. By the 19th century, however, the manuscript was in Bombay, as it was called then, with a descendant of the Zoroastrian who had commissioned it originally. We have other textual examples that will be displayed alongside this object, including an early fragment of the Asham Vohu prayer that was written in Sogdian sometime between the years 800 and 900, and that was later deposited in Dunhuang in China. We'll also have a later manuscript of the Indian version of the Bundahishan that dates to the 17th or 18th century. So these texts, they speak to the movement of Zoroastrians and the diaspora across different periods. So now I will hand over to Tim Stanley, who's going to continue with the next slide. Thank you.
Right, good evening. So far, we've heard a lot about the history of Iran over a very long period from the 4th millennium BC, and now we're in we're beginning the period after the 7th century AD, when Iran entered a new phase, the one in which Islam was dominant. So the collapse of the Sassanian monarchy, with the death of the last king Yazdegerd III in 651, was it's a great rupture in Iranian history, but it didn't mean that, despite the long period of Islamic rule, it didn't mean that Iranian culture disappeared altogether. And one of the main symbols of the continuity is the fact that the history that was written down in the Sassanian period, the history of Iran, as it was imagined by Iranians in the later Sassanian period, this text survived, and many different texts survived, including one called the Khudoy Namag, which was a history of the rulers of Iran in sequence. And these texts were often translated into Arabic, because in the Islamic period, Arabic became the main literary language for Muslims. Middle Persian continued in use, but it was used among the Zoroastrian community. And in the northeast of Iran, in fact, beyond what had been Iran in the Sassanian period, in Central Asia, where the Sogdians lived, that became a center to which the Arab armies invaded in the 8th century, and they established Muslim rule there. But the Muslims who arrived there included large numbers of Persian speakers who had become part of the Muslim forces as they passed through Iran. And also, there must have been quite large numbers of people who had initially fled the Muslim advance, moving from Iraq and Iran into this place in the northeast. So you had a large body of people who were Persian speakers. Persian became the lingua franca of the region rather than Sogdian or Arabic. And the courts that were established there in the 9th century eventually fostered the emergence of a new type of Persian written in the Arabic script, and later on, often with large numbers of Arabic loanwords. So that's the language we call modern Persian, and or sometimes New Persian. And one of the first great works in modern Persian was the Shahnameh, or the Book of Kings. And this was the translation of perhaps directly from Middle Persian, but also perhaps from Arabic, of this history of the kings of Iran. And it was completed about 1010 by a court poet called Ferdowsi, who is very famous in Iranian literature. And the text actually both summarizes Iranian history. I mean, it is an epic poem. It's not a scientific history. So it includes material that is drawn from Zoroastrian myth. It includes material that's part of a sort of legendary literature that flourished, we know, in the Parthian and Sassanian periods. And especially in the later periods, it becomes quite a respectable source for the history of Sassanian Iran. And the glorification of some rulers and the details of the exploits of heroes provided the rulers of Iran with an idea of how they should behave as monarchs, but it also provided the population more generally with a sense that Iran had existed for a long time, and it was something which they were able to carry with them forward into history as a part of their identity. And from the 14th century onwards, we know that Iranian rulers of Iran, who were not all Iranian, had very fine copies of the Shahnameh made, which were often illustrated. And this is how we represent the Book of Kings and the continuity of the knowledge of history of Iran in the exhibition, is by showing the beautiful examples, three of which you see before you. And the one on the left you can see is in the Royal Asiatic Society. And this is produced in the 15th century for one of the lesser rulers of the Timurid dynasty, called Muhammad Juki. And this is quite interesting manuscript because it's very fine, and it was later taken to India. And in the process of changing hands, the dedication to Muhammad Juki was removed. One of the things that the people who did that didn't realize that is among the illustrations is the one that we see here, and that the banner, which is being flown above the rocky landscape, actually includes the name of Muhammad Juki in it. So that's how we've kept an awareness of who had the manuscript commissioned. Next to it is a very magnificent illustration, which is quite large and impressive, and it shows one of the numerous battles that are described in the Shahnameh, and it's from the Shahnameh of Shah Tahmasp, which was produced in the second quarter of the 16th century for the second Safavid ruler. And it's this illustration is now in the Sarikhani collection. You'll see that there's quite a number of Sarikhani manuscript illustrations in this section. And on the right, we have a 17th century illustrated Shahnameh, which actually comes from the Royal Collection. And this is a manuscript that was commissioned by Gharaja Khan, who was the Safavid governor of Mashhad. And he had this manuscript made for himself. And later on, it came into the possession of a local ruler in Afghanistan who presented it to Queen Victoria. Next slide, please. And of course, on very similar to the changes created by Alexander the Great's invasion, you have a similar situation in Iran, that there's a period of Arabization, and then you have the conversion of a majority of the population to Islam, which probably took place from the middle of the 8th century onwards. We don't think, but that there was still at quite late date, there were large populations that were relatively autonomous and kept their original faiths. But gradually the conversion took place. And as I said, Arabic became the main medium for Islamic scholarly and polite literature. There was a great variety of forms of Islam that have developed in Iran, and Iranians made great contributions to the medieval Islamic civilization. And that's represented here by the horoscope of Iskandar Sultan, which is the greatest Islamic object in the Wellcome Collection in London. And it's in a section on that shows the revival of Iranian, well, first of all, the contributions of Iranian scholars to the international intellectual culture of the Islamic world, which in itself then contributed to European knowledge of various scientific disciplines in the later Middle Ages. But we have on display one copy of a scientific book which is in Arabic, and another one which is from the 13th century, originally written in the 10th. And the same text is still being copied in the 17th century, but it's then been translated into Persian. So this, as well as works like Shahnameh, which are works of literature, gradually Persian is used for more and more types of literature, including scientific and theological discourse and all sorts of things. And in this case, we see this wonderful design that in 1411, Iskandar Sultan, who's another one of the local Timurid rulers in Iran, he ruled in Shiraz, he had his own horoscope produced as a luxury manuscript. And this is what we have here. Where at the same, so this is the period from, in the 15th century, Iran was very diverse in terms of the types of Muslims that were around. There were Ismailis, there were Imami Shiites, there were Sunnis, and many others. And but of course, the great event in Iranian history from this Islamic period is the formation of the Safavid Empire from 1501 onwards, because that's the point at which Iran becomes an Imami Shiite state officially. So the Safavids take over, and there's a very strong sense before that a countering, as it were, the idea of the longevity of Iranian civilization through which is born in the Shahnameh. There's also a sense of history, a new sense of history, first, that is centered on Islam. And you also get illustrated histories which tell the story of the heroes of Islam. And in the early Safavid period, Shah Tahmasp had a manuscript of which is a Farnameh, which is which you use to tell your fortune. And so many of the images in that are express the ruling family's adherence to Imami Shiism. So here we have Imam Reza saves the Sea People, which is one of the illustrations from this great Farnameh of Shah Tahmasp. So this is symbolic of the coming of Imami Shiism to Iran. Next slide. And obviously, Imami Shiism is one of the components of an Iranian identity today. It's what distinguishes Iranians from the surrounding peoples. And but another one, of course, is the Persian language, and especially Persian literature. And Iran is really quite an extraordinary country in the sense of the vigor with which the literature of the past still is alive among the population. And the famous thing being, of course, that lots of Iranians know quite a lot of Persian poetry by heart. And so in order to represent this, we are showing both manuscripts and objects which are connected to Persian literature. And we're showing you here a wonderful manuscript from the British Library on the left, which is the Humayun of Khaja Kermani, which it's one of the great manuscripts of the British Library. It was prepared in 1396. And in this marvelous illustration, you can see Prince Humayun arriving at the castle where Princess Humayun lives, and this is their first encounter. And he looks up and sees Princess Humayun on the top of her sleeping tower inside her beautiful garden. And the whole of this painting is actually based on the two half lines, the couplet that you can see positioned on top of the cypress tree in top right. And all that the verse tells you is that, that Princess Humayun had a face like the moon, and it was surrounded by the night, which was the representation in poetic terms of Humayun's beautiful hair. So the artist has taken this idea and extrapolated from it this beautiful scene. And that is something that, late, the 15th, 16th century and after, was the tradition to create these great images based on what sometimes are no more than snatches of poetry. But the way that the poetry works also affected the artistic production of Iran. So you don't just find inscriptions on objects, but also that some of the poetic ideas and the poetic structures actually fed into the way that the art was constructed. In this case, we're showing you a very fine carpet that's in the V&A collection, which was produced in the latter part of the 16th century, and which has five couplets from a ghazal by Hafez, woven into the border. And the thing about it is that this poem, among other things, talks about birds and bulbul and flowers, and it's therefore appropriate to put it next to a pattern which consists of flowers and birds, but there isn't the design is not a literal rendering of what's in the poem. It's an appropriate juxtaposition of suitable themes, and that's one of the things. I mean, it's one of the things we try to explain in this section on literary excellence. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sarah Piram, who will talk about the next slide.
Thank you, Tim, and good evening, everyone. The 8th section on royal patronage will demonstrate how Iranian traditions of kingship were reborn after Islam, with the return of royal customs like robes of honor. This led to the production of luxury textiles, such as the robe that you see on the left. This piece in particular from the V&A collections was made by cutting up and reassembling a 17th century Iranian robe of honor into a sakos, which is the main vestment worn by bishops in the Orthodox Church. Oil painting was also introduced to Iran in the 17th century, when the capital, Isfahan, was at the center of international trade. The Christian Armenian merchants played a major role in this trade, and they largely influenced the arts of the Iranian court. These two portraits on the right, which are on loan from the royal collection, were signed by an Armenian painter named Marcus. They have undergone significant conservation work by the royal collection, and they will be displayed for the first time in Epic Iran. Can we have the next slide, please? Thanks. Highlights of this section on royal patronage will also include technical architectural drawings from the 19th century. On the left, you have drawings of complex vaulting systems. We've been working with an architect based in Iran, Hamid Abhari, who has created a navy sequence for us that shows how two of these small drawings can be used to model a 3D building. So for anyone who likes architecture, this is really an exciting part of the exhibition. In the AV that Hamid has created, the digital visualization of the drawing is replaced by an actual building that matches it. The example here that you see on the screen has been taken from the main bazaar in Tabriz in the north of Iran. In the same section, we will also recreate the splendor of Iranian architecture, especially in Isfahan, with life-size paintings from the V&A collections that replicate tilework patterns from the city's major monuments. We call this reproduction in the center a gore with its triangular shape, and it represents a section of a dome. We will display 3 of these gores in the exhibition. These works on canvas are actually very large. You can't see it from your screen, but they are very large and imposing. They're about 10 meters long. And this one in particular on the screen is from the Sheikh Lutfullah Mosque in Isfahan. There's an image of the actual dome next to it, and also another one behind me. By displaying huge tilework paintings, we will be able to recreate some elements of Iranian architecture, mostly from the Safavid period in the 17th century. Of course, we will also display architectural tiles from different periods in the same room, from the 13th to the 18th centuries, showing all the differences in techniques and their evolution. Next slide, please. Thanks. The next section will explore Iranian art in the Kajal period from 1786 to 1925, but mostly what we will see will be art from the 19th century. The Qajar dynasty looked back to their predecessors to legitimize their power, whilst also seeking to modernize and scope out new relationships with Europe. This is why we call this section the old and the new. Fashion will feature in this part of the exhibition with a woman's full outfit on the left image. Women of the Qajar court would have dressed in clothes like this, with cinched waists and puffy skirts, and they're often depicted wearing similar outfits in paintings. The introduction of photography in Iran in the middle of the 19th century also had a huge effect on the way Iranians represented themselves, and many representations were actually based on photography, such as the painting that you see in the center from the V&A collections, but also representations of the Shahs themselves. The portrait on the right shows the ruler Nasser al-Din Shah sitting on a sofa in court dress. Nasser al-Din Shah ruled Iran for nearly 50 years, from 1848 to 1896. And it was him who introduced the art of photography at the court. And this painting was certainly based on a photograph too. Despite some efforts to modernize the country under the Qajar rule, Iran remained a fragile state in many ways, and this led to popular action and to the collapse of central authority in the early 20th century. The last Qajar ruler was deposed in 1925, and the new Pahlavi dynasty was born. I hand over now to Ina Sarikhani Sanman, who will talk in more detail about modern and contemporary Iran with the last section of the exhibition. Thank you.
Well, I just want to thank everyone in the team. It's been such a great experience, curating this exhibition with John and Tim and Sarah and Alex and Astrid, and I've really enjoyed everything. Anyway, we've been through lots of changes in history, and I just want to come now and explain some of the excitement in presenting, probably for the first time ever, modern and contemporary Iranian art alongside archaeological and Islamic art. And it's a great way for us to show how, despite all the changes that continue to happen in Iran, this tenacious identity and this self-renewal and self-examination continues. In this section, we try and deal with two really big themes in here. And one is the change in the early 20th century with the coup by Reza Pahlavi in the early 1920s. So having had this kind of sleepy Qajar thing, what propels the changes that happen in the mid-20th century are driven by two factors. One, of course, is the discovery of oil. And secondly, of course, is the mass modernization of Iran. The modernization was, quite democratically propelled in many ways, in a sense, because we have in the 1906 onwards, the constitutional revolution. So the mass middle classes wanting change, wanting liberalization, wanting to have a say in the politics of the country. And Reza comes and he decides that he's going to make Iran a modern country. So it's, infrastructure, education, liberalization. He bans the veil. He makes the turban the province of only the clergy. And in all of this period, you have a greater interaction with the world. First of all, he imported lots of experts, and technological experts to Iran to help with all of the modernization program. And secondly, lots of Iranians started traveling abroad for the first time, both eastwards and westwards. And in particular in the art scene, what's interesting is that although you have the teaching of arts, from the 19th century onwards, from 1860 and 1861 for art and photography at university level within Iran, and you then have an establishment of a school of art under Kamal al-Mulk, in the 1940s, you see the establishment of the Faculty of Fine Arts as part of Tehran University, which was a commission by the then Minister of Culture who had studied in Paris, and he asked André Godard to set up a new approach towards the teaching of the arts based on the French atelier system. And so you then, this happened in 1940, have this simultaneous occupation of Iran by the British and the Soviets. So you then also have these two very ideologically different forces settling within Iran and helping this foment of change and interaction. And what you see very quickly is you start seeing this move towards art as something that's really immediately from this slide very, very recognizably modern. And what we call the democratization of art in the 20th century. And very early on, despite this kind of, this teaching of art, we see here on the left, for example, Parviz Kalantari, who's doing something that's recognizably Cubist inspired. Actually, Kalantari would then later on go and become, alongside Marco Gregorian, one of the great founders of land art, over a decade before it even became a thing in the West. But what you see next to it is something that's very new. And artists became very interested very early on in doing something that was authentic, that was, looking at vernacular idioms, at expressions, both religious and lay, and using them within art. And what you see here is a work by Sirach Mirkonian, which was done in 1957, and which would then go on to win the first prize of the first Tehran Biennale in 1958. And one of the opportunities we want to take in this exhibition is to really enter into a new framework of what modernism was. There was traditionally this idea that modernism was something that happened in the West and then sort of gradually dissipated over the globe, in a kind of osmotic way. But what we see here is that we have Iranian artists who are exploring different modes of modernism very dynamically and with great expression. Thank you. Astrid, go to the next slide. And the most famous of these artists probably within Iran are Charles-Hussein Zenderoudi and Parviz Tanavoli, who really, what the critic Karim Emami would go on to call, as the founders of Iran's pop art. And here you see Zenderoudi playing with religious talismans and themes and magic symbols and words, and in a way that is very, very hypnotic and descriptive. And we're also showing this work by Sia Armajani called Meme, which uses meme as the magic word letter that's associated with the name of the Prophet Muhammad. And here you see Allah, and you have Ya Allah written over and over again, magic symbols, the angel Gabriel, and he's mixing it on these rolls of muslin. This is well over 120 centimeters wide, and combining these different idioms and phrases together to create something that's very expressive, and what he called the kind of the newspaper of the everyday people. By using these things, of course, we're not saying that Zenderoudi or Armajani are in any way religious. In fact, Armajani was a Marxist and left Iran as an exile very young because his parents were worried that he'd get into trouble. But they are instinctively and immediately Iranian. We're really happy to show this work that's owned by the Tate Modern by Parviz Tanavoli, the poet and the beloved of the king. Here, Tanavoli as a sculptor, and of course, we're used in the West to see big sculptures along roads and alleyways, which we don't see in Iran in the same way. But Tanavoli, as a sculptor, when he returned to Iran, was looking for local idioms and expressions, and he seized on the poem of Farhad and Shirin. Farhad is the legendary hero, the architect, and the sculptor who tries to win the heart of the Queen Shirin. And as anyone would know from Nizami's version, he is unfulfilled. Shirin remains true to her king. But here you see Tanavoli, he's grabbed her around the waist, and the kind of the quite phallic arrow and the yellow limo, Persian slang for breasts, indicates something else entirely. But it isn't just with these kind of themes that you see. You here see Marco Gregorian and this great earthwork made of mud and clay, or Monir's very early work here from a private collection in London, showing how she used the architectural tradition of cut mirror to start exploring the possibility of its material possibilities to make works of art. And we're very happy to have this very early piece by Monir, which shows when she was still working with reverse painting of the flowers of her native Qazvin. Next slide, please. But there are also other works. I mean, we show Sohrab Sepehri, the fantastic poet and artist. And again, in this early work, he traveled and studied in Japan for 2 years and gone on to study and travel in China in the very early 60s and came back via India, which really fueled his mystical and spiritual and philosophical yearnings. And in this early work, you really see those traces. So, you know, these artists are being influenced by East and West and bringing them together. Whereas others, you know, were doing something entirely different. So Behjat Sad, who's using oil, the oil slick, as a kind of abstracted calligraphic work in this wonderful piece. Or Bahman Mohasses, who has become probably the most successful of all the mid-century artists here in this wonderful beach scene. And anyone who was in Iran, I mean, I remember this from my early childhood in the 70s, you know, it becomes so fashionable to go up to the Caspian and go on the beach. And of course here, although Mohasses is working with surrealism, you can see the kind of the homoerotic implications of that. And in all the wonderful, you know, dichotomies of Iran today, and then, and he was an openly gay man, there was a wonderful retrospective of him at Tomoka, Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, in 2017. And we also have this lovely, beautiful portrait of Lady Matin Daftari's daughter, Suri, showing the kind of abstract minimalism that she liked to explore. Next slide, please. But of course, all of this isn't just art in art's sake. It's all happening in this epoch of incredible, fervent cultural exploration. So on one hand, you have experimental theatre and dance and performance art, most famously by the Shiraz Persepolis festivals, which took over from the Tehran Biennale in 1967 and continued under the war and until the revolution, and which was televised on national TV, which was really experimental itself. You know, they used to have weekly experimental dance troupes televised on TV. But this, of course, was quite provocative to the more conservative within the society. And in a society where political dissonance were suppressed in the way that religion couldn't be, the voice of opposition of religion became larger and larger. And of course, the dissent wasn't just a tool religious. It wasn't about just provoking the religious. You had huge, you know, liberal, Republican and democratic forces who wanted to mitigate the control of the Shah. Ardashir Mohasses, a fantastic graphic artist and illustrator. And here you see this portrait of him called The King and I, and clearly this chained person at the foot of what is clearly a pompous and corrupt and inhumane monarchy. And as you know, this all ends in revolution. And the one image we have of the Pahlavis of the Shah and Farah in the AV, I mean, the show is really punctuated by very strong, good AVs here, leaving on the day they leave Tehran. And then great scenes and photography taken by Iranian photographers, both of the revolution and the Iran-Iraq war, which ruptured and changed Iran dramatically. Next slide, please. There is no doubt that this change that happened with the revolution, which was then cemented in this long drawn-out Iran-Iraq war, really did change some fundamentals within Iran. The Islamicization of the society meant it changed the way that people could behave and interact and dress. There's a huge amount, millions went into exile, and then Iran emerged, you know, sort of in the early 80s. That was very different. Now, Rafsanjani, and here we try and show and mark that by the work Turbulent by Shirin Neshat. Now, Shirin Neshat went to study abroad and then didn't return to Iran until 1992. And when she went back, she just couldn't believe. She said that experience changed her life completely, because the country that she knew and was so familiar to her had suddenly become so alienated and strange. And of course, this would have been an experience that would be more dramatic having gone through the period of absence and come back. But without doubt, people understood that they were now in a different place. And this two-screen work, which Shirin was very happy to be showing, really marks this change, where you suddenly see a man singing to a male audience, and the woman here, portrayed by Susanne Dehim, the fantastic sound artist, standing before an empty chamber. And instead of singing, because she has no words to express what she does, she goes into this mad sort of polyphonic, tonal chant to express her existential anxiety about the state that she finds her in. There are other artists who also explore this alienation, namely Shadi Radhirian, in this wonderful portrait. Shadi was a student of Bahman Jalali, who was one of the great photographers of the 80s and 90s, and who we feature in the AV as a photo documentarist. And they went and looked at the archives in the Golestan Palace. And there's this incredible tradition of photography in Iran, as I'm sure many of you know, since Nasser ad-Din Shah loved photography. And of course, if the king loves something, then it becomes the court fashion. So there's an enormous amount of court photography. And she saw women in the Qajar era who were wearing short skirts and riding bicycles and playing with makeup. And this wasn't allowed to her in the 90s in Iran. And so she's done this incredibly moving series where she poses a supposed 19th century Iranian woman with props from the modern age. And in this work, she has an old-fashioned camera, but she also has a Leica. And that direct gaze of her sitter out is really a feminist statement within itself. And we also have others like Mitra Tabrizian, who expresses the alienation that people feel, the anxiety, the dislocation. And interestingly, in bringing out little details like a child's shoes or a couple, if you can see that in the middle of that photograph, that massive panoramic photograph at the bottom, walking side by side, that people do still have dreams and ambitions and secrets and hopes for the future. Next slide. But of course, other artists do something completely different. And I really hope that in this section of the exhibition, viewers will really get a sense of how extremely great art is in contemporary Iranian scene, both in Iran and outside. There was a big liberalization under Khatami in the late 90s. And by year 2000, there were over 50 commercial art galleries in Tehran alone. There's a really vibrant scene. There's incredibly savvy collectors. And there is, of course, because of technology, an interaction with the world. So although there is a seeming alienation of Iran as a politically isolated country, particularly under the sanctions, what you have is an enormous amount of communication and interaction with different people. And here we have three great works. We have, which in some way, we think of when expressing this idea of the tenacity of the identity of Iran, we think that all words must be historical looking. But of course, one of the great things about Iran is its adaptability and its inventiveness in all of its cultural facts. So here are three works by artists who look a little bit backwards. So we have Hostra Hassan Zadeh, who was a soldier, a very young soldier in the Iran-Iraq War, and then went on to art school. And he creates this kind of pop, punky, lightbox installation where he's kind of reclaiming his idea of self-representation. He feels alienated as an Iranian man in the international world, the caricatures, etc. Then you have this work, Stardust, by Ali Bani Sadr, who's one of the rising stars of Iranian art. And here, this incredibly large-scale oil painting, full of movement and dynamic, but unbelievably controlled. And when looking at that, I think we all recall that kind of busyness of some of those pages of the Shahnameh we saw earlier. And here on the right, a painting by Farid of Mossad, the great toppled hero of democracy of 1953, toppled by the US-American coup. And when you see him with his clenched fist, really expressing the defeated hope of the dreams of the mid-20th century. Thank you, Asrin. And you'll also see works like Shiraz Hushiari, the fantastic icon of intellectual and spiritual art, who's currently based in Iran, not far from me actually, from here. YZ Kami, he also looks beyond and transcendentally. His incredible portraits, which on one hand, look like, they should be telling you something about the person, but actually it is the inner, the reflective, the experience of that sitter that he conveys through these rather abstracted thoughts. And it would be impossible to have a sense of contemporary Iranian art without mentioning Farhad Moshiri, whose iconic work, Eshq, on one hand seems to look back towards the poetry and the literary tradition that we have in Iran, but really in the way that so much of Iranian art does, it's kind of irreverent and humorous. It's talking about pop songs, and with the Swarovski crystals within it, the commercialization of the art market, the commoditization of art in the contemporary world. And his rather sadly deceased wife, Shirin Ali Abadi, with this fantastic photograph called Miss Hybrid, about girls in Tehran who just want to have fun. Final slide. It's, I think by now you'll get a sense of the enormous variety across all different media of contemporary Iranian art scene. We wanted to end with this perhaps as an icon, not just for what is happening in Iran today, but kind of also the experiences of the last year. And this is a work by the artist Hussein Valamanesh, who's now based in Australia, who has very strong, inventive works based around nature and spirit and the ephemerality of existence. And he'd said, in was bugzarat, this too will pass. And what comes next? For Iran, for all of us as humans, we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you very much, Ina. That was great, and apologies for everybody. We are running a little bit over, but it is very difficult to keep everything very short when it comes to so much material. So we do have time to visit some questions, and if we don't manage to get to yours, we will keep them, and you can send in other questions and we'll pass them on and try to get back to you. So one of the questions that has come in, which I think probably would be best for you, John, why Epic Iran and not Epic Persia?
Yes, thank you. It's an interesting question. Well, the fact is that Iranians themselves have always called their country Iran and themselves Iranian, and this goes back to the time of Darius, actually, in 500 BC, and he says, "I am an Iranian," in one of his inscriptions. And a little bit later, in the Sassanian period, we have references to the land of Iran, Iran Shah. So that's the term used by Iranians themselves. But for that part of the country in the southwest, around about Persepolis, they called that Parsa, even in ancient times. So this was one of the provinces of the Persian Empire, actually, the province in which Persepolis was situated. And this idea was got hold of by the Greeks, who started calling that part of the country Persia to start with. And then they and others following them, European commentators, applied the name Persia to the whole country. So obviously it's really a misnomer. And Reza Shah in the 1920s ordained that the country should henceforth be known as Iran. So I think from our point of view, as Iranians themselves have always called it Iran, and as it is known as Iran nowadays, Epic Iran is much more suitable than Epic Persia would have been.
Thank you, John. This is a question that's come in asking, did you get any participation from the Iranian government with the exhibition? Perhaps, Tim, you might like to answer this one. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, what was the question?
Did you get any participation from the Iranian government with the exhibition?
Oh, okay. Well, we had hoped that we'd be able to borrow from Iran, and we, the relationship with people like the National Museum of Iran, which John has a long relationship with, were good, and they provided us with images for the catalogue. But in the end, the sort of logistic problems were too great for us to actually lend from Iran. So it was really practical problems rather than anything else that prevented the full cooperation.
Thank you, Tim. And this question is for Ina. What is the relationship between Bahman Mahasses and Ardashir Mahasses? Can you elaborate on their different styles?
Oh yeah, I mean, they were actually cousins, but they weren't particularly kissing cousins. They weren't very close to each other. They had quite separate lives and quite different, and were kind of propelled by quite different ideological and personal, impulses. So Bahman Mahasses left to study in Italy and actually spent most of his life then really based largely out of Italy, where he worked as an artist and a sculptor. And part of that, I mean, actually he did come backwards and forwards, and he was really good friends with poets, and he translated lots of books into Persian, so he felt involved, but he personally was quite an awkward and quite a challenging person, and ended up spending, as I said, most of his life abroad. And he was very much obsessed with this kind of the anti-hero, the surrealist, the mythological. Ardashir Mahasses, on the other hand, really comes from this tradition of graphic art. There's a very strong tradition of graphic drawing and satire and humor within Iran, and he very much saw his place as being a critique of Iran within Iran itself, and only left really at the very end of the 70s when his works were becoming very problematic under the Shah, and he then spent his time in New York, where he carried on making comment on the corruption and criticism of government. Now, of course, not the criticism of the Shah, which is what he did in the period that he's represented in the show, but then also of the corruption of power under the Islamic Republic.
Thank you, Ina. A question about the Shahnameh. Was the character Rostam based on Rostam Farhad, who was an Iranian dynast from the Isfahudan family? I think that might be one for you, Tim.
Yeah, I think that Rostam Farhad is named after Rustam, who is the hero in what would then have been the Khodaynameh, which was later the Shahnameh. So as far as I understand it, I mean, Rustam Farhad is a very important historical figure at the end of the Sassanian period. So I don't think he can be equated with this hero whose exploits last for about 900 years in a legendary period.
Great. We've got one asking, have you included performance and music of Iran through the centuries? Perhaps, Sarah, would you like to talk about music?
Yes, sure. Thank you for the question. And yes, we will have Iranian music in the section on Kajal art. We are collaborating with City University of London and their Department of Musicology. And we've been working with Professor Lodan Nushin from this university, who has provided with many great advice on on the music we'll have in the exhibition.
Thank you. And there's been a few questions coming in of people asking whether, because of quarantine and for people coming from Iran who aren't able to come as well, will the show be planning to travel as an exhibition?
No, the show won't be traveling. What Ina might like to speak about her exhibition in Berlin, which follows.
That's very kind of you, Tim. Yeah, sadly the show won't travel. There's so many lenders, and there's logistically such a complicated show to put together that we can't do that. And we're sad that because of Corona, we won't probably get as many visitors from abroad as we'd like. You're all welcome, and I'm sure that Sarah and Alex and Tim and John will be doing lots of, and myself whenever else, we'll be doing lots of virtual tours. We're also doing another exhibition in Berlin at the end of the year, which will be looking at the Sarikhani collection in interaction with the collections in Berlin itself at the Pergamon, both of the ancient Near East collections and the Islamic collections. So if you're in Berlin, come and see that. You're very welcome.
Thanks, Ina. I'm aware that we have already run over by about 15 minutes, so perhaps this would be the final question. Apparently the V&A has a considerable trove of Persian art that has never been exhibited, according to one of the speakers. Why is that? Perhaps Tim, you might.
Yeah, well, we do have a great collection of Iranian art, but this has been our desire, is to show as much of it as possible, and this has been an opportunity to show some of the objects that have been in storage for some time. I mean, to think we've the casts of the warriors from Susa have been in storage for probably more than 100 years, and those have been brought back to life and very beautifully conserved by our sculpture conservation. And equally, the enormous, I mean, you cannot have very many occasions on which you can show 3 objects which are 10 meters long in one room. I mean, there's practical difficulty about it. But we do have we have an enormous number of Iranian objects which are either on display or very accessible. For example, we've got about 1,000 ceramics in our ceramics galleries. And we have the great works of Iran, including the Ardebili carpet in the Jamil Gallery, which is devoted to the Islamic Middle East. And actually, this is one of the things about this exhibition, is that the way that museums negotiate their space for their collections has meant that at the V&A, Iranian art has formed an important part of a display of the Islamic Middle East. But there's a tendency for Iran to get the sort of Iranian tradition to be submerged by this wider framework of the Islamic period. And so the exhibition has been our great opportunity to concentrate on the Islamic period as something, as a continuation of the Iranian tradition. And so that's why we're very pleased to have this opportunity to show these little scene works.
Great, thank you. Well, I think if you've got any further questions or comments that you would like to send in, please do email them to our info account. And as I said, we'll pass them on and try to get back to you with that. And just a final notice to say that the next IHF webinar will be on the 12th of May, which will be a talk with Professor Charles Melville on the Shahnameh, which he will be discussing with Ina. And details of this will be posted on our website soon, so please do sign up for that. And with that, we all wish you a very lovely evening, and thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.